For our next session, please welcome to the stage Tom Chi. He's with GoogleX, the advanced research arm of that conglomerate, and his speech is entitled, 2 trillion trees, no problem.
Yeah. I didn't title it that, but I talked on the phone with the organizer, and they titled it that, so that's now the title of the talk. But yeah, we will talk about planting roughly that many trees. So very quick backdrop, scooting all the way back, taking the long perspective. Since the invention of agriculture, the world population, the human population, has increased from 7 million to about 7.5 billion today, so about 1,000x. And I think that a lot of us are kind of already stuck in a kind of doom and tragedy loop where it's like, oh, well, that's just too many people. You know, we increased the population by 1,000x, that's way too many people. You know, how could we possibly get to a sustainable planet? But I'm gonna draw an analogy that you might have not heard before. But if you were to take all of human biomass, so if you were to pull all the people together and weigh them, it's about 350 million tons. And that is basically, you know, biologists estimate exactly the same weight as all the biomass of ants on the earth. So if you round up all the ants and you weigh them, it weighs the same as all the humans. There's more of them because they're smaller. But one difference between ants and humans is that humans eat about 3% of their body weight per day, so 2.8%. And then ants eat 30% of their body weight per day. So what that means in practice is that every single day, ants actually consume 10 times more of the earth than we do, right? It's as if there was like a population of 75 billion people. That's how much stuff that they're eating. But we don't sit here thinking, oh my gosh, there's 10 times too many ants. There's no chance of making a sustainable planet with all these ants on the planet. And the issue here is not so much the amount, it is the style. Because when ants go and consume, you know, parts of the biosphere, they actually add more ecosystem services than they consume. They aerate soils, they cycle nutrients, they do so many useful things in the environment in the process of eating 10 times more than us, consuming 10 times more than us, and we're the species that kind of dropped out of that role. You know, because it's not just ants, like literally every other species on Earth does more ecosystem services than it consumes, otherwise it'd already be gone. We're the only one for a very short time period is trying to do it differently and not going so well. So the question then is, how can you go make it so humanity is able to provide more ecosystem services than it consumes? Now we gotta quickly look at where we are. So this is no future predictions, this is just a tracking through of October 2018 what we did. So if you start before the Industrial Revolution around 1750, here's how many gigatons of carbon dioxide came from coal, oil, gas, cement, land use changes. So all the stuff on the left is human activities. And actually, if it was just human activities and nothing else happened, we'd already be at 570 parts per million. So a total disaster. I mean, the game would already be long over. But luckily, we're not alone. The ecosystem helped us out. It absorbed 582 gigatons into the ocean, almost 650 into the land in the form of soils, trees, wetlands, and then the rest of it's still up in the atmosphere. That's why we have 1 trillion tons left over, of carbon dioxide. But the ocean and the land already pulled down 1.2 trillion tons. Now, it means nature is on our side, but we need to start working with nature because we can't rely on this for sure, and we can't let the ocean keep absorbing all of it because in absorbing 582 gigatons, it's also become 30% more acidic during that time period. So pretty important moves. Now, this gives us a really concrete thing that we can go after though. If the debt that we have is 1 trillion tons, it's time to go pay down that debt. And there's really two sides to the equations. There's the paying down the debt and there's the reduction of emissions. Like you know, the Paris Agreement, all these sorts of things are actually about reduction of emissions. I think that's really important. But like, you know, if we just lobby for reduction of emissions, it's like trading out a high interest credit card for a lower interest credit card, right? Like you're still racking up debts. At some point you need to pay the debts because actually if we emitted no more carbon from this moment on, the planet would continue to warm for 700 years just based on what was the debt that's in the atmosphere. So it is important for us to figure out how to pay 1 trillion ton debt of carbon dioxide. And by the time the end of the fossil fuel economy happens, we may need to pay something like 2 to 2.5 trillion. But we won't do that yet. We'll just focus on the 1. Because if we can do 1, we can probably do 2. It'll be fine. So a little bit about my background and like the lens to go solve this problem. Like how do you take 1 trillion tons? How do you go pay that debt off? Well, my background is as a technology executive, inventor, more recently an investor, and I was on the founding team of GoogleX. We invented the self-driving car, Project Loon, which is meant to provide internet to every square inch of the earth, a contact lens that measures your glucose levels for folks with diabetes, Google Glass, Project Wing, a new approach to artificial intelligence called Google Brain. But those projects are not the important thing. Like, there's a thing that I discovered in the process of making stuff like this, which is the idea of the invention catalyst. So there is a thing where you say, well, here's a cool thing that we have, and we made a new invention, it made that thing 20% better. And that's a type of invention that's very useful for the world, and most inventions are like that. But every once in a while, you come up with an invention which is an invention catalyst. It actually completely changes the landscape of what's possible. So something like a self-driving car, something that you guys may or may not know about regular cars, though you probably know just from owning a car, but people that own a car spend less than 4 to 5% of their time driving the car. So that actually means 95% of the time the car is totally idle. And so we call this the utilization of the car. Utilization of cars are about 4%. Now, if you could have self-driving cars, and they could be shared across many people, then the utilization on average of cars could easily move up to 40% and still have plenty of time for maintenance and all these sorts of things. And if you could go improve the utilization of cars by 10x, then you can actually reduce the number of cars in the world by 10x. So imagine, being able to go to any city and remove 80% of the cars. At least 70%, but maybe even 80 or 90% of the cars we could remove from the city. Now, this is importantly catalytic because once you remove all those cars, you actually now get to think about how to redesign a city to make it more livable for folks. And we used to joke in the team when we were working on the self-driving car, the spin out is still working on it, that we would go to all the signs in the city that said parking lot and erase the trailing letters so it just said park. That we would take all this land, like 20% of urban land, and make it into parks and public spaces and community spaces. And that's what an invention catalyst enables. Like, it changes the landscape so you can reimagine how you do everything else. Now, that's for tech and transportation or whatever. What does it look like to bring the invention catalyst idea to the task of paying down 1 trillion tons? So I'm going to share one invention catalyst that I'm an advisor and investor to. I've actually invested in over 15 of them so far. So if you want to know a lot more about this, you can reach out to me, and we could talk about the other 14. But this one is a company called Biocarbon Engineering. In the middle there is Susan, the CEO. And their technology they've invented these drones that can plant 120 trees per minute at 1/10 of the cost that it currently costs to plant a tree. And over on the right-hand side is our community manager arena next to some mangroves that we're restoring. You can see they're already about 2 feet tall over there. Now, why is this a potential invention catalyst relative to 1 trillion tons? Well, a thing that you guys may or may not know about trees is average tree weighs between 2 to 20 tons, though a giant redwood can weigh 1,000 tons, which is crazy. But anyway, average tree weighs 2 to 20 tons. And trees are about 48% carbon by mass, depending on cellulose versus lignin content. But 48, 50% is a good estimate for how much of the mass of a tree is carbon. And this is a very wise audience, but some of you may not know that, that almost all of the mass of a tree comes from the air, right? Like 95+% of the mass of a tree comes from the air. Trees are effectively crystallized air. So when you basically look at a tree and it's 50% carbon by mass, all that stuff came straight out of the air. So it basically lays out the possibility that if you could plant 1 trillion trees, 2 trillion trees, and they're able to get to maturity, they by themselves would pull down 1 to 2 trillion tons worth of carbon. All right. Now, what does that look like in practice? Well, you guys might have read the recent paper in Science, and I'm a person, I used to be a research scientist, so for anybody who's interested in reading the papers, you can take a snap of the tiny URL at the bottom and it'll link you to the papers. This is true all throughout the talk. I forgot to mention that before. But these are basically places where we could be planting trees. There is 1.6 billion hectares that could be restored. There's 0.9 billion, so about 1 billion hectares that isn't, contentiously used by some other activity right now, so not being used by farming, not being used for suburban space, that kind of thing. even though there's a lot of programs where you can go add trees to urban and suburban spaces. But for a moment, even if you just focused on the unused space, there's a huge amount of space to be able to go restore. Secondarily, the sort of restorations that can happen have large-scale systemic effects. So this is great work if you guys have not been following this, but Abigail Swan's research group out of the University of Washington has been modeling continent-level weather changes as a function of vegetation pattern changes. And in this case, she was analyzing, hey, we're having a bunch of droughts and wildfires in California. So what happens when we get regional tree loss in California to the rest of the nation? And you can see it changes net transpiration, it changes the height of different weather events, it changes the temperature, and at the very end is the change in gross plant productivity. And you'll see what happens is as we lose trees in California, actually the entire Midwest all the way down to Texas dries out. And if you wanted to, so that means your farmlands are failing, you're getting droughts that you weren't getting before. And what this looks like is kind of the recipe for the disaster that we're doing, but it is also the recipe for the solution if we were to go the opposite direction. Like if you go and play the models in the other direction and you add forests to California, you add forests to the Pacific coast, it actually restores farmland in the Midwest. And I can't think of that many political issues that would be more bipartisan than add a bunch of trees to California and then have farmland in Iowa grow better. So we can change the overall weather patterns of continents based on where we choose to go plant these trees. Now, jumping back to those tree planting drones real quick, some of you might have already done the math, but 25 of our drones can plant 1 million trees in a 5-hour planting day. So, yes, because we do. 25 drones can plant 1 million trees in a 5-hour planting day. We only plant from 10 to 3 because we want good daylight and lighting conditions. Yeah, so I mean, we could do an 8-hour day on some places of the year. It's fine. Yeah, no, so we can get into lots of details, but we've already planted more than 10 million trees on 4 continents, so the restoration is underway for sure. This is not a theoretical exercise, that's all I'm saying. And what it would mean, like let's say you wanted to plant 1 trillion trees, and you said, well, the plan then is 20 billion trees per year for 50 years. It actually turns out that would only take about 9,000 drones and 450 operating staff, though to your question, you want to have a much larger staff that kind of checks in on the trees. Like you don't need to check on a tree like every minute, but you know, check on the trees like on a monthly basis, make sure things are cool. And actually the operating budget, so excluding the seed costs and that sort of thing, because some seeds are more expensive, some are a fraction of a penny, then it would take about $80 million per year in operating costs in order to plant 20 billion trees per year. That's what we're talking about to pay off the debt, not something that is into the trillions. We could plausibly do it with the right sort of invention catalyst. And I'm going to close off this talk because I talked about one invention catalyst, but I am, you know, I kind of left my role at Google as a technology executive and as an inventor to really spur on the invention of these types of technologies all around the world. And I already have more than 15 investments that are technology, you know, like invention catalysts that can allow us to imagine the future totally differently. And it includes things for soil, like Hunter was mentioning, reinventing agriculture, air conditioning, because refrigerants are a very potent greenhouse gas, mariculture, tons of different things that I'm supporting, and I'm raising a venture fund at the moment to be able to do a lot more. So I think that's it. I got 1 minute if anybody's got questions. Nice. Yes, question. Yeah, that fires them into the ground up to 45 meters per second, which is 100 miles per hour. And yes, it does these seed pods where the middle is a seed and then surrounded is a nutrient mix. And we've also been working on mycorrhizal mixes, which help to support the growth of the plant. And then the outer layer is basically a biodegradable polymer that basically biodegrades within 1 day of exposure to moisture. Yes?
Of the trees that have been planted, how many are still alive? How are you monitoring their success 1 month, 1 year, etc.?
Yes, we have a different fixed-wing drone that does all the monitoring, and we also have quad drones that do maintenance as well. So we can do targeted application to go address different things that can address the trees. There are some things like, well, I don't want to get into lots of things. There's sometimes like invasive rodents and that sort of thing. You have predation issues in some areas. If you really want to talk about planting a bunch of trees, we could get into it because we've done a bunch of projects. And one last thing to go know about this is that this is not for planting monocultures. The point of being able to plant all these things individually is we work with local ecologists and they tell us what is the collection of species which are appropriate for ecological succession. So we're planting in ecological succession order and just speeding up the seed radiation for ecological succession. Oh, I am? Okay. Tomorrow I'm doing something. That's it. Thank you.